Hello and welcome to Web Development 101 with Alex Merced. On this show, we'll talk about all the basic concepts of web development in a way that anyone can understand, whether it's front-end web development, back-end web development, and full-stack web development. If you're new to web development, I recommend listening from episode 1 to understand all the concepts from beginning to end. You can also learn more about my own personal projects over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and welcome to another episode of Web Development 101. And this week we're going to be talking about the backend with JavaScript. So just talking about sort of the JavaScript language and its use in the backend. We know that it can be used for front-end stuff, and you can use things like React, Angular, or Vue to create UIs and user experiences. But you could also, once upon a time, you didn't have JavaScript accessible on the back end. And a lot of details of this story I learned when I was watching on Skillshare, a great service. On Skillshare, there's this Node.js masterclass, which really goes in depth about Node.js, and it's super interesting. I'm still watching. I learned a lot. But in the first few videos, they go through sort of the history of Node. And it's really fascinating because once upon a time, you had no JavaScript in the backend. So essentially, you would use maybe Perl or PHP or Ruby sort of to do your website backend. So basically, you had your front-end developers that would use HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you had your back-end developers that would be using like PHP, Perl, and Ruby. But basically, someone said, like, why can't we just also use it on the backend? Why can't the server run JavaScript? So they basically take, I think it's called V8, is the particular JavaScript engine. Again, the JavaScript engine is the actual program that actually interprets the JavaScript code. And there's like 3 of them, one by Google, one by Microsoft, one by the Firefox people. And they take that JavaScript engine and they build sort of a server framework about it. And this is referred to as Node.js. And what this did was just create sort of an environment where you can create JavaScript code that runs on your server and does all the cool server stuff you would do in PHP, Ruby, fetching information from a database, creating APIs and whatnot. And at first people thought it was like a joke. It's like, those plebs trying to use JavaScript on the back end. It's just not proper. The right way to do it is to use some more low-level language or, other language. So that happens, but it continues to find its place. And then eventually what happens, I guess JSON, JavaScript object notation, begins to start sort of becoming the norm for how you handle APIs over XML. So the result is for some reason, I guess there was some issue of databases and a database that would work really well with Node.js. And at the same time, MongoDB sort of was looking for its footing. And there was just sort of this, I don't quite fully appreciate why, but this is just sort of mix in heaven at the right time, because you had this JavaScript framework that worked really well with this particular NoSQL database, which is a discussion for another day. And at the same time, this growth in the sort of API structure of JSON. And between those 3 working together, it made it just a lot easier to work with JSON, helping Node capture a lot of market share. But the problem is that Node, still in development, and a lot of people, weren't used to coding in JavaScript on the back end. They were used to using things like Ruby, because Ruby on Rails was sort of the big stuff in the time. People still use Ruby on Rails. From my understanding, while there's other Ruby frameworks, Ruby on Rails has proven not to necessarily be the most efficient or fastest in modern times. So people are moving away from Ruby on Rails. But I also saw a website that went over sort of the speed of different backend frameworks, and still some of the top ones are still Ruby based. So things like, I think Ruby Sinatra is a lot faster and whatnot. I have to go find that page, but it was an interesting read. So the question was, how do people wanted to use Mongo Node to work with JSON, but they didn't want to have to go like relearn how to use JavaScript specifically for the backend. They rather use sort of what they were used to. So they invented this sort of like intermediary called CoffeeScript, which is basically, I think it had like a more Ruby-like syntax, but then compiled into Node JavaScript. And this allowed a lot of people to be able to work with Node and in this environment without necessarily having to sort of relearn how they do everything. But also Node was still basically in development, so still it wasn't perfect, or a lot of things that, and then also the nature of Node is that a lot of what you do in Node is is done through dependencies, is done through other libraries. It's not like a lot of other languages that have standard libraries that everybody uses, so everyone knows that's the library to use. There might be several different libraries in Node for form validation, user authentication, interacting with the database. So, there wasn't, so it was very difficult managing all these packages and sitting there and trying to get all these dependencies installed every time you create a new project. So you had all these, so eventually they create what was NPM, the Node Package Manager, which basically created basically you had this repository of all these dependencies, all these sort of Node libraries. And then with the Node Package Manager, you could just kind of install. And the experience is very similar to like using pip for Python, where you can just quickly download whatever you need for whatever Python project you have. And this sort of made the experience with Node much easier. But again, a lot of it relied on all these libraries to fill in gaps, fix bugs, whatnot. So, the demand for having some sort of framework that sort of has already kind of thought through all these things was kind of there. And that's kind of where Express JavaScript comes in. It was this framework to develop websites that kind of thought through a lot of those stuff, worked around a lot of the bugs that at the time existed in JavaScript. So that way you had this really stable framework with which to begin your sort of web development in. Now, since then, Node has worked out a lot of those bugs. So technically, you could just use Node and be fine. And it would be a lot simpler process today versus when Express was being created. But Express has kind of become the standard of sort of the standard backend framework if you're going to use JavaScript for your backend. And then I think the same people who made Express have made this newer framework called KOA, KOA, that also has is supposed to be an improvement, have some nice upsides and whatnot. Cool. So in summary, Node.js kind of runs on the server and reads JavaScript that's made to do server type actions. And the cool thing about it is that what it does, it just keeps running until there's no need to run code. So until basically it keeps sort of a running to-do list. So what it does, so that's where we get into like sort of asynchronous code and whatnot. So what it'll do is that as it runs into certain commands, if it cannot complete them right away, it adds them to a to-do list and continues on. And then it continuously kind of keeps coming back. And then also it builds out like a dependency tree. So basically you can have one file, but if it references another file and that file references another file, the Node.js builds this sort of big picture of your entire program and all its dependencies. It's pretty interesting how it's kind of working under the hood. But that's what Node.js is really the center of all sort of working with JavaScript behind the scenes. I'm not aware of this, if there is a alternative to Node. Essentially, if you're using Express, if you're using KOA, if you're using pretty much anything on the back end with JavaScript, it generally works sort of on top of Node. And then again, since then there's come a lot of other transpiled languages or transpilers for existing languages to allow you to kind of transpile your code into JavaScript, whether it's for front-end purposes or for back-end purposes, similar to like CoffeeScript. So I'll leave it at that. I'll talk to you guys next week. Have a great one and enjoy.